I was unpacking the last box of my grandmother's china when my husband kicked me down the stairs. Not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech designed to make you lean forward in your chair. I mean that Jacob Harlow, the man I had stood beside at an altar in a cream silk dress, the man I had nursed through pneumonia and 2 broken ribs and the death of his father, placed the flat of his shoe against the small of my back while I stood on the 3rd floor landing and pushed. I tumbled down 11 steps with a cardboard box of my grandmother's blue and white Wedgwood plates, and when I landed at the bottom, sprawled across the hardwood of our 2nd floor hallway, with shards of porcelain scattered around me like the wreckage of a life I hadn't yet understood was ending, he stood at the top of the stairs and looked down at me. Not with horror, not with immediate, horrified regret. He looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture that has inconveniently fallen over and now blocks the path you intended to walk. "You were supposed to pick my mother up at the station," he said. "I told you this morning. She's moving in with us for good." I lay there on the floor. My elbow was bleeding. 3 of my grandmother's plates, the ones she had brought from England in 1962, wrapped in her wedding dress because she had no other padding, were broken into pieces so small they glittered. I could feel the carpet burn on my palm and the specific clarifying pain that comes when your body has absorbed a shock that your mind has not yet processed. I looked up at him. He was wearing the blue Oxford shirt I had ironed on Sunday. His hair was neatly combed. He looked, in every external sense, like a reasonable man. "Jacob," I said. My voice came out strangely flat, the way voices do when the body is managing crisis. "You just pushed me down the stairs." "You were blocking the landing," he said. "And we have things to discuss about the household arrangements." He turned and walked back down the 3rd floor hallway, and I heard his office door close behind him with a soft, decisive click. I sat on the floor for a long time. The afternoon light came through the hallway window and made the broken china glow. I could hear sounds from below, the kitchen specifically, and it took me several seconds to understand that those sounds had been going on since before I fell. The particular clatter and rearrangement of someone who is not merely cooking but reorganizing, someone who is measuring space with her eyes and making decisions, someone who has already decided that this place belongs to her. My mother-in-law, Diane Harlow, had arrived at our house at 2:30 in the afternoon, while I was in the attic retrieving boxes I had foolishly stored there when we first moved in. I hadn't heard a car in the driveway. I hadn't heard the front door. I had simply come downstairs to find her in my kitchen, opening my cabinets with the proprietary ease of someone conducting an inventory, and she had turned to look at me over her shoulder with an expression of mild, benign superiority. "Oh, good," she had said. "You can help me move these mugs. The left cabinet makes more sense for everyday dishes. The right one should be for the good crystal. You've had this completely backwards." My name is Claire Harlow. I am 34 years old. I have a master's degree in urban planning, a career I built from nothing over 8 years, a small but meaningful savings account, and a house, technically our house, mine and Jacob's, that I had chosen and negotiated for and decorated with care. I had done the research on school districts, even though we didn't yet have children. I had selected the paint colors and the particular shade of white for the trim, which is not simply white, but a warm, off-white that the manufacturer calls ivory lace, and which took me 4 weekends of samples to settle on. I had made this house into something that felt, genuinely and for the first time in my adult life, like home. And Diane Harlow was standing in my kitchen, opening my cabinets, and telling me I had them backwards. I had met Jacob 6 years ago at a conference in Chicago. He was an architect then, genuinely talented, with a way of describing buildings as if they were living things, as if the relationship between a structure and its inhabitants was a kind of conversation. I had found that beautiful. We dated for 2 years across the distance between Chicago and Philadelphia. Then we made the decision to close the distance, and he moved, and a year later, we were married in a small ceremony in the Botanical Gardens with 40 people we loved. Diane had not attended the wedding. She had sent a card, wishing you both happiness in your future. No signature beyond Mom. It was the kind of message you'd send to a colleague's retirement party, not your son's wedding. Jacob had opened it at the kitchen table, read it, set it down, and said nothing for 2 full minutes. Then he said, "She'll come around." And I had believed him, because I was in love with him, and because I was, in those days, a woman who still believed that goodwill and patience could dissolve most difficulties. She had not come around. Not in the way I'd hoped, but she had come around in a different sense. She had circled us over the years, the way weather systems circle a low-pressure zone, getting incrementally closer, incrementally more present, until one day I woke up and she was simply inside the house, and I could not say with precision when she had gotten in. It had begun with phone calls. Jacob and his mother spoke every day, sometimes twice, sometimes more, and this in itself was not alarming. But the calls had a particular quality that I noticed without naming for a long time. They happened behind closed doors, not always, but frequently. And when Jacob emerged from them, he was often quieter or occasionally agitated in ways he could not or would not explain. Once, after a 40-minute call, he had come to me and said, out of nowhere, "My mother thinks we should be saving more." We had been saving 20% of our combined income. I asked him what she meant. He said he wasn't sure. The subject dissolved into dinner and dishes and the ordinary current of evening. Diane visited us every few months for long weekends that I had come to approach with the specific preparatory dread of a person who knows the weather is going to be bad and cannot do anything about it. She arrived with gifts, always slightly wrong: a cookbook for a cuisine we didn't cook, kitchen towels monogrammed with her own initials, and she received these missteps with such cheerful certainty that they were in fact perfect choices that I found it impossible to respond correctly. If I gently suggested that the pillow might not quite work with our sofa, she would look at me with the patient, faintly wounded expression of a woman who has tried very hard and has been misunderstood. "Jacob's always loved that color," she would say. The implication hung in the air like smoke, that I was the intruder in a relationship that predated me. Jacob did not contradict her. When she rearranged our bookshelves and I mentioned it afterward, he said, "She was just trying to help. Let it go." I had let many things go. I was not unaware, and I was not a fool. The error was not stupidity, but hope, the specifically feminine variety that women are trained from girlhood to maintain. The hope that patience will eventually be recognized and rewarded, that things will resolve themselves into fairness. That hope is a trap. I know that now. The morning of that day had started ordinarily. I had woken at 6:15, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table in the early quiet that I have always loved, that particular pre-noise hour when the house feels like it belongs entirely to you. Jacob had come down at 7, showered and dressed, already on his phone, and poured himself coffee without sitting down. He kissed my cheek. He said something. I had been reading and said, the way you do when you're distracted and assume what has been said is inconsequential. This is the moment I have returned to most often in the weeks since. That Whatever he said, and I believe now he said it deliberately, in that tone. Knowing I was not fully listening, I did not hear it. And by the time I understood what I had failed to hear, the door at the top of the stairs had already closed behind him. I pulled myself up from the hallway floor and looked at my bleeding elbow and what was left of my grandmother's china. I picked up the pieces large enough to pick up and set them carefully in the box. My hands were not shaking. That surprised me. There was something happening in my chest that I did not yet have a word for. Not quite grief and not quite rage, but the specific interior weather of a woman who has just understood something she cannot ununderstand. I left the box in the hallway and went downstairs to the kitchen. Diane was at the stove. She had found my apron, the blue linen one my sister had given me 2 Christmases ago, and tied it around her waist. The kitchen smelled of onions and bay leaf. She had moved the fruit bowl from the counter to the windowsill, relocated the cutting board to the other side of the sink, and emptied the cabinet above the stove of the spice rack I had organized, and replaced its contents with her own things, a collection of unfamiliar tins and jars, her spices, brought from her house 4 hours north. She had brought her spices. She had packed them into her bags and driven 4 hours, and she had arrived while I was in the attic, and she had let herself in with a key I had not given her, and she had begun cooking in my kitchen with her own spices. I stood in the doorway and looked at all of this. Diane stirred without turning around. "Jacob said you wouldn't mind if I got started on dinner," she said. "I'm making a stew. I used to make it for him every Sunday when he was growing up. He's always loved it." "Diane," I said, "when did you get here?" She turned and smiled, the smile of a woman who has never, in her life, found herself in a room where she did not belong because she has never permitted herself to occupy such a room. "About an hour ago, I let myself in. Jacob said you'd probably be busy." She paused, and her gaze moved briefly to my elbow, to the dried blood, and back to my face, and nothing in her expression changed. "You should wash that. Dinner will be ready in about an hour." I washed my elbow at the kitchen sink, 3 feet from her while she stirred. The kitchen was full of the smells of her cooking and the rearranged architecture of my cabinets, and I stood there with cold water running over my arm, trying to locate, somewhere inside myself, the appropriate response to a woman who has walked into your home and installed herself in your kitchen, and whose son has just pushed you down a flight of stairs, and whose arrival has been announced as a fait accompli. I turned off the water and dried my arm. Diane was a handsome woman, 61, with the kind of bone structure that wears age well. She was wearing dark slacks and a cream blouse under my apron, as though she had dressed for an occasion, and she carried herself with a composure I had once admired, before I understood what composure, in certain people, is actually made of. "Diane," I said, "I think you and Jacob and I need to sit down together and talk about what's happening." "Of course," she said pleasantly. "Jacob should be down for dinner. We can talk then." "I'd like to talk now." She set down her spoon and turned to face me fully. And here was the thing about Diane Harlow that I had never quite been able to articulate to anyone, not to my sister, not to my friend Rachel, who had listened to years of my diplomatically phrased accounts and always said, "That does sound frustrating," in a tone that suggested she wasn't entirely sure I wasn't exaggerating. The thing was that Diane was never rude. She never raised her voice or deployed the kind of direct cruelty you could point to and say, "There, that is what made the wound." She was something more sophisticated than rude. She was warm in a way that crowded you to the edges of the room. Her goodwill was a form of occupation. "Claire," she said, her voice gentle and full of the specific texture of a woman speaking to someone who needs to be managed. "I understand this is a big change. I know it can be overwhelming to have family join a household, but Jacob and I have talked about this for months, and we both feel it's the right decision. I'm not getting any younger, and I can't keep up that house alone. We thought you understood this was coming." "I didn't," I said. "No one talked to me about this." Something moved across her face, brief, controlled, smoothed immediately. She had expected me to say something else, or nothing at all, and my directness had required her to adjust. "Jacob said he'd spoken to you," she said. "He's not spoken to me about anything involving a permanent change to our household." She picked up her spoon again. "Well," she said, returning to her pleasant register, "I'm sure there's been a miscommunication. We can sort it all out at dinner." She turned back to the stove, and the conversation was over, and I stood in my kitchen with my bleeding elbow and the smell of her stew in the air, and I understood, with a precision I had been resisting for years, that the miscommunication she described had not been accidental. I went upstairs to the bedroom and called my sister. Margot is 3 years older than me and has, over the course of my marriage, become my primary navigator of situations I could not see clearly from inside. Not because she is smarter, she would say she isn't, but because she is not inside. She has the clarity that distance provides. She had never liked Jacob in the specific way that people who love you sometimes fail to like the people you have chosen, not with hostility, but with a careful, consistent reserve I had attributed for years to personality differences. She answered on the second ring. "I think something very bad is happening," I said. "Tell me," I told her. I told her about Diane in the kitchen with her spices and my apron, and about Jacob's words at the top of the stairs, and about the fall. I described it as matter-of-factly as I could, but I felt Margot go very still on the other end in a way that told me she was not receiving this information matter-of-factly. Claire, he pushed you down the stairs. He said I was blocking the landing. He pushed you down the stairs. I know that's what happened. Are you hurt? My elbow. I have some bruising. The china is mostly broken. I'm coming, she said. Don't go back upstairs. Don't eat her dinner. Don't have whatever conversation they're planning to have with you at the table. You wait for me. Margot. Claire. He pushed you down the stairs. Please let me come. I said yes. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. Below me, I could hear the clatter of Diane's cooking, the faint percussion of her occupation. Above me, the intermittent murmur of Jacob's voice through the floor. I had a strange, suspended feeling, as though I were in the hinge of something that had not yet decided what it was going to become. It was 3:47 in the afternoon. At 4:44, Diane's phone, which she had left on the kitchen counter while she carried dishes to the table, lit up with a notification. I was in the kitchen doorway. She was in the dining room setting plates. I saw the screen illuminate, saw the bank's name at the top, saw 2 lines of the message beneath it, and something that had been suspended inside me for the past hour crystallized into a shape I could finally name. The notification was from First National Bank. The message began, "Transaction alert. Transfer of $47,000 from joint account ending in..." Diane came back into the kitchen and saw me looking at her phone. She went pale in a way I had never seen before. Diane Harlow, who was never rattled, who had spent the better part of 6 years managing every situation with serene, unassailable confidence. She went the color of old ash. She picked up the phone and turned it face down on the counter. "Jacob," she said, and her voice had lost its pleasantness for the first time, thin and sharp and slightly too quick. "Jacob!" I heard his footsteps on the stairs. Jacob appeared in the kitchen. He looked at his mother. He looked at me. His mother said very quietly, "Jacob, it says here that..." "Not now," he said. His voice was sharp in a way I had rarely heard. He was looking at me. "What transaction?" I said. "Claire." "What $47,000, Jacob? From what joint account?" The silence in the kitchen was thick enough to touch. The stew was still bubbling on the stove, and the smell of it, bay leaf and onion and fat, was turning my stomach. "Sit down," Jacob said. "There are things I need to explain to you." "I don't want to sit down. I want you to tell me what that notification was describing." He looked at his mother. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. The economy of it, the precision, communicating volumes in a single movement of her chin, and I understood that this conversation had been rehearsed. They had anticipated this moment and prepared for it. I was standing in a scene the two of them had already run through, and my role was to receive information and then be managed back to a position they had already decided was acceptable. "We needed to move some funds," Jacob said, "for the house renovation, for your mother's, for the additional bedroom." "We have not discussed any renovation," I said. "We have not discussed any additional bedroom. I was informed of your mother's arrival today when I was lying at the bottom of a staircase. You were blocking the landing. You pushed me down the stairs, Jacob." He opened his mouth and closed it. Diane, behind him, said nothing. $47,000, I said. "From a joint account. To where?" Jacob looked at his mother again. She looked at me. And in that moment, in the triangulation of those two looks, in the way they deferred to each other and excluded me, I felt the last of my hope for an innocent explanation drain quietly out of me. I had believed, for 6 years, that I was a partner. I had believed the house we shared and the account we held and the life we were building were collaborative, that they belonged to both of us, that we made decisions together. I had been wrong. I had not been a partner. I had been a resource, and the accounting of that resource had been conducted, quietly and carefully, without my knowledge. I walked upstairs and locked our bedroom door, a lock I had never before used, and sat on the closet floor with my phone. I called the emergency line of a family law attorney whose name I'd caught at a work event 2 years ago, and left a message describing, as calmly as I could, the situation. Then I opened my banking app and tried to log into our joint account. My login credentials no longer worked. I sat with that for a moment. The specific, very particular fact of it: Jacob had changed the login credentials. He had done this, I would later establish the timeline, sometime in the preceding week. The $47,000 transfer had occurred 3 days ago. The new credentials had been set 2 days ago. The notification to Diane's phone today had been triggered not by the original transfer, but by a secondary, smaller transfer to a different account. And Diane had received it because she was, apparently, listed on the account in some capacity I had not been aware of. My mother-in-law was on our bank account. What I felt was not shock. It was the feeling of looking at something that has been in front of you for a long time and finally seeing its actual shape. I had believed that the structures of our shared life, the account, the deed, the understanding between us, were held in good faith. They were not. Margot arrived at 6:30. She texted from the driveway, and I came down the back stairs, narrow and steep from the second floor to the mudroom off the kitchen, and I let her in through the back. We stood in the mudroom with the coats and the boot rack between us, and she looked at my elbow and my face and held my hands in both of hers. "Okay," she said. "Tell me everything." I told her. I told her about the bank notification and the changed credentials and Diane's name on the account. And as I talked, I watched Margot's face move through a sequence of expressions she was working to control. That specific movement from concern to anger that passes through a clenching of the jaw before it becomes something usable. "Do you have access to any money right now?" she asked. "My personal account, but anything joint, that's okay. That's enough." She looked toward the kitchen door. From the other side, we could hear Jacob and Diane talking. "Do you want to leave tonight?" "Not yet. I need to understand what they've done first. If I leave without knowing the full scope, I lose the advantage of being here." Margot looked at me. "When did you become strategic?" "About an hour after someone pushed me down the stairs," I said. She nodded slowly. "Then tell me what you need." What I needed was her phone. Diane had seen me looking at the notification, and they would be watching my phone, my access, what I might be documenting. But they did not know Margot was here. She was an abstraction in their accounting of me, my sister, somewhere else, and she had come quietly through the back door with a phone neither of them had ever seen. "What are we looking for?" Margot asked. "The house," I said. "Specifically the deed. I want to know if anything has changed." We stood in the mudroom while Margot searched the county deed records, publicly accessible, easily searchable. The voices in the kitchen had quieted. There was a scraping of chairs, dishes being cleared, Diane's voice pleasant and modulated, "I'll do the washing up." The settled domesticity of it made something tighten in my chest. Claire. Margot's voice was very level, the levelness she deployed when she was controlling something strong. I looked at her phone. She had found the entry for our address and found something that had not been there approximately 8 months ago when we refinanced. The deed now listed 3 names: mine, Jacob's, and Diane Harlow's. We stood in the mudroom for a long time after that. Through the door we could hear Diane washing dishes in my kitchen, in my house, in the house whose deed now bore her name. The cold certainty of it moved through me from chest to hands. This had not been improvised. Diane Harlow had not arrived today with a suitcase and spices on a whim. She had arrived at the conclusion of a plan. The plan had involved, at minimum, adding her name to our joint bank account, which required Jacob's cooperation, transferring funds, which required his signature, and modifying the property deed, which required a notarized signature from both named owners, which meant a signature bearing my name. I had not signed anything. I was certain of this in the unambiguous way that you are certain of things you have not done, which meant that either Jacob had forged my signature or he had found someone to notarize a document with a signature that was not mine, or there was some other mechanism, and I would need an attorney to tell me which of these it was, and how reversible it might be, and what it meant for the house and the account and the marriage and the life I had been living under the impression that it was mine. "Margot," I said. My voice was very quiet and very steady. "I need a lawyer tonight." "I know a woman," she said. "Let me call her." While Margot stepped outside, I stood in the mudroom and listened to Diane washing my dishes, and something inside me, something that had been patient and yielding and careful for 6 years, that had said, let it go and perhaps I'm overreacting, went very quiet. In its place, something settled. Not rage, not grief, but a cold and particular clarity, the kind that comes when you have finally stopped hoping and started knowing. I was going to get my house back. Diane was still washing my dishes when Margot came back inside and told me the attorney could see us. It was 9:15. We left through the back door with my laptop and my personal documents and the photographs I had taken, quickly, instinctively, of the notification on Diane's phone before she turned it over. As I crossed the dark driveway toward Margot's car, the kitchen light clicked off behind me. The house went dark except for the third-floor window, Jacob's office, where a light still burned. I did not look back for long, just long enough to understand that this was not the end of something. It was the beginning. Rachel Chen's office was on the 4th floor of a building in the legal district, and she was waiting for us when we arrived. She was 45, trim, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and an expression that managed to be simultaneously warm and completely unsentimental. The expression of someone who had sat across from many women in many varieties of this situation and had learned to be useful without being soft. She poured us water and looked at everything I had brought. Screenshots of the bank notification, the deed record, the account history I had pieced together before the login was changed, and asked me a precise series of questions. When Jacob had added Diane to the account, whether I'd signed any documents in the past year I hadn't fully read, whether I had a prenuptial agreement, whether I had documentation of my financial contributions to the mortgage. I had everything. I am organized in the way that people are organized when they have spent their whole adult lives knowing their financial security depends on their own management of it. Tax returns, bank statements, the original mortgage and refinancing documents, insurance policies, receipts for every major renovation. Rachel looked at all of it. Then she looked at me. They moved quickly, she said. The timeline suggests this was in motion for at least 6 months, possibly longer. Is it reversible? I asked. The deed modification, possibly yes. The question is whether your signature was forged, which would be fraud and criminal in addition to civil, or whether there's some other mechanism they used. I need to look at the full document. She paused. The bank account changes are more complicated because Jacob had legal authority to add a signatory. But the transfer, $47,000 to a third party without your knowledge or consent, may be actionable. She closed her folder. I need to file some emergency motions tonight to prevent additional transfers. Can you give me authorization to act on your behalf? Yes, I said. Then I need you to go somewhere safe tonight, not the house. I know, I said. Margot drove me to her apartment. Outside, under the orange light of the street, she turned off the engine, and we sat for a moment. He pushed you down the stairs, she said again. Quietly this time, not for emphasis, but as though she was putting it somewhere, filing it in the correct place. He did, I said. Whatever else happens, whatever the lawyers work out and whatever her name is on the deed, that happened, and you're not going back to a place where that happens. I thought about ivory lace trim and garden beds. I thought about the lamp on the second-floor landing. I thought about 6 years of making something beautiful and someone else deciding that it belonged to them. No, I said. I'm not. We went upstairs. Margot made tea. I sat at her kitchen table and began to write down everything I remembered, in the order that I remembered it, with dates where I had them. My attorney had asked for this. I wrote for 3 hours. By the time I finished, it was almost 1 a.m. The tea was cold, and Margot had fallen asleep on the couch with her phone on her chest. I read what I had written. It was long and specific, and it told the story of a woman who had missed things she should have seen sooner, but who was not missing them anymore. I saved the document, sent a copy to my attorney, and closed the laptop. Tomorrow was going to be a very different kind of day. Chapter 2. What We Built in the Light. The attorney called me at 8:17 the next morning. I had slept for 4 hours on Margot's pull-out couch and woken at 7 with the specific, dense consciousness of someone whose mind has not stopped working, even while the body rested, delivered directly into the situation, present and clear-eyed. Rachel Chen's voice on the phone was brisk and precise. "I filed an emergency motion to freeze the joint account pending investigation," she said. "The judge has a 9 o'clock opening. I may be able to get a temporary restraining order on any additional asset transfers, but I need some additional information before then. Specifically, have you ever granted power of attorney to your husband for any purpose on any document?" I thought about this carefully. "No," I said, "I have not." "Have you signed any document in the last 18 months that you did not read in full?" A longer pause. I tried to recall the ordinary paper signing of a married life. Mortgage renewal documents, insurance renewals, the hospital intake paperwork from a minor procedure in the spring. "There was hospital paperwork," I said, "consent forms, standard intake documents." "For what facility?" I told her. She was quiet for a moment, the silence of someone writing things down. "I'll look into that," she said. "It's likely nothing, but the deed modification required a notarized signature, and if your signature on the deed is not yours, we need to understand how a notary certified it." She paused. "Claire, I want you to be prepared for the possibility that this has been planned more carefully than we initially understood. The first account modification, adding Diane Harlow as a signatory, occurred 14 months ago." 14 months. I sat with that number. 14 months ago, Jacob and I had gone to dinner to celebrate the second anniversary of our refinancing. He had ordered champagne. He had been warm and attentive. I had been happy. 14 months ago, while I was happy at dinner, he had been adding his mother's name to our account. "I understand," I said. "There's one more thing." Her voice shifted slightly, more deliberate. "I spoke to a colleague this morning who specializes in property fraud. He's reviewed the deed document and found a concerning detail. The notary whose seal appears on the modification filed her retirement with the state bar 18 months ago. Her license was inactive at the time the document was dated." The line was very quiet. "That means the notarization is invalid," I said. "It means significantly more than that. It means someone used the seal of an inactive notary to certify a document. That's document fraud, a criminal matter in addition to the civil one." She paused. "I'd like to bring in the detective agency I work with to document the full scope. Will you authorize that?" "Yes," I said. After the call, I sat on the edge of the pull-out couch and thought about 14 months, a year and 2 months of planning, incremental moves made in the bureaucratic underbrush where people do not habitually look, small changes, carefully sequenced, depending on me not to notice until the mortar had set. I had a thought then that I would return to many times. Diane had understood something about me that I had not fully understood about myself, that I was a woman who let things go, who attributed malice to misunderstanding because misunderstanding was more manageable. She'd planned around it and she'd been right up until the moment she wasn't. The moment she wasn't right had been 4:44 the previous afternoon. I showered, borrowed clothes from Margot, and by 9:30 I was at her kitchen table with my laptop open and my documents organized. Dennis Farrell, the investigator Rachel had recommended, 22 years in financial fraud cases, met me at a coffee shop at 10. A compact, unremarkable man with reading glasses and the professional composure of someone who has seen many varieties of this situation and is not disturbed by any of them. He reviewed everything methodically, asking questions as he went. He was interested in the timing, the 14 months, the sequence of account changes, the deed modification and its faulty notarization. He was interested in the destination of the $47,000. "Do you know what account received the transfer?" he asked. The notification didn't show the full destination. "We can trace it. With the legal proceedings underway, the bank will be obligated to disclose. But I want to start looking now at what they might have been preparing to do with the money." He looked at me over his glasses. "In cases like this, where one party has added an unauthorized co-owner to a property deed, there's typically an endgame, either to sell the property and divide proceeds in a way that excludes the legitimate owner, to use the property as collateral for a loan, or to establish a pattern of joint ownership that complicates a divorce settlement." He paused. Have you and your husband discussed divorce? No. Officially, as of yesterday morning, I had no idea anything was wrong. He nodded slowly. Then they may have been building toward a confrontation. The arrival yesterday was likely intended as a fait accompli. Here is the new arrangement, already in place, and you can accept it or leave. A pressure tactic. Make the situation sufficiently uncomfortable that the other party agrees to arrangements they would not otherwise agree to. I thought about Jacob at the top of the stairs, about the specificity of his announcement. She's moving in with us for good. Not, we need to talk about my mother. A declaration, a new reality presented as already decided. What do you need from me? I asked Dennis. Everything you have, he said, and 48 hours. I gave him everything I had. The first call from Jacob came at 11:14. I let it go to voicemail. The message was carefully calibrated, controlled, concerned. The voice of a man who had prepared this and delivered it with the tonal precision of someone who has practiced managing difficult situations. He said he was worried about me, that there had been a miscommunication. That word again with its implication of innocent confusion, of two parties equally responsible for a failure of information, and that he wanted to explain everything. He said, explain twice. He did not say anything about the stairs. I did not call him back. The second call came at 1:40 from a number I didn't recognize. Something made me answer, a flicker of instinct. Is this Claire Harlow? The voice was a woman's, older, with a direct, unhurried manner. It is, I said. My name is Patricia Sloan. I was Diane Harlow's neighbor in Millbridge for 23 years. She wouldn't know I'm calling. I've been trying to reach you for several weeks. I couldn't find a direct number, and I didn't want to call the house. I sat up straighter. Margot, across the room, looked at me. I held up a hand. Mrs. Sloan. What did you want to tell me? She told me. She told me for 11 minutes. And I listened to every word, and by the end I had filled 2 pages of Margot's notepad. When she finished, I said, Mrs. Sloan, would you be willing to speak with my attorney? I would, she said. That's why I called. After I hung up, Margot read my notes over my shoulder. When she finished, she sat down across from me. How long? She asked. At least 2 years, I said. Possibly more. Patricia Sloan had watched Jacob grow up and had watched Diane manage the household after his father's death. She had watched Diane begin, approximately 2 years ago, to speak openly about a plan, not in those words, but with the accumulated specificity of a woman who has made a decision and cannot entirely contain her satisfaction about it. A plan to move south, a plan involving Jacob's house. A plan that involved money Patricia had understood, from context, was not entirely Diane's own. She had heard Diane on the phone, through the thin walls of the Victorian houses in that neighborhood, discussing figures, discussing timelines, discussing, once, a name that had startled Patricia enough that she had written it down, a real estate attorney, local to our county whose specialty was property transfers. I called Rachel immediately and gave her the attorney's name. I know him, Rachel said, and her voice had a quality I had not heard in it before, something moving toward satisfaction. He's had a complaint filed against him with the Bar Association in the past 18 months, a separate matter, but related enough to be interesting. A pause. Claire. I think we're dealing with something more organized than I initially assessed. I want to bring in the DA's office. Do it, I said. Margot made lunch, the practical grounding act of feeding someone who cannot feel hunger, and we sat at her table while I told her what Patricia had said. 2 years, she said. At least, the refinancing may have been an opportunity. New title documentation means new signatures, means a chance to put something fraudulent into the paperwork. We sat with this. Outside, a bus went by, and somewhere a dog was barking, and all of it was ordinary in the way that the world continues to be ordinary even when individual lives inside it have become extraordinary. I need to go back to the house, I said. Margot looked at me. Not to stay, to get things, documents, personal property, photographs, my grandmother's china, what's left of it. I'll come with you, she said. You'll stay in the car. I need it to look like I'm alone. I need them to feel like they're in control. She looked at me for a long moment. She was clearly deeply uncomfortable with this, but she understood what I was saying and she nodded. "I'll have my phone out," she said. "If you're not back in 30 minutes, I'm coming in." We drove to the house at 2:30. Margot parked one house down and I walked to the front door. My key still worked. They had not changed the locks, which told me something about the confidence with which they had expected yesterday to proceed. The expectation had been that I would accept, that the woman who let things go would let this go too, would absorb the new arrangement and find her level within it. The house was quiet. The kitchen had been further reorganized overnight. Diane's spice rack installed above the stove, her kitchen towels where mine had been, her dishes stacked in the cabinet where I kept my everyday plates. The pot from last night's stew was washed and drying on the rack. It looked, in its terrible way, like a home. Someone else's home. I could hear movement on the third floor. I did not go upstairs. I went instead to my study, the small room off the hallway, with my desk and my filing cabinet and the bookshelf I had built myself over 2 weekend afternoons, the first summer we lived there, and I took out the files I needed: tax returns, insurance documents, the original mortgage papers, the deed as it had been before, now superseded by the fraudulent modification, but still relevant as documentation of the original state, my professional licenses and educational certificates. I was transferring the last folder into my bag when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Not Jacob's. Too light, too deliberate, with a particular cadence of heels on hardwood. Diane appeared in the doorway of my study. She was dressed as carefully as the day before, and she looked infuriatingly rested, as though none of the events of the previous evening had disturbed her sleep at all. She regarded me and my open filing cabinet with an expression that was measuring something. "I wondered when you'd come back," she said. Her voice was pleasant and held something underneath it that was not warm. The voice of a woman on ground she has decided is hers. "I came for some documents," I said. "Of course." She moved into the room and leaned against the door frame, not far, just enough to be inside it, with a composure that she was, I thought, performing very slightly. "Jacob is at the architect's office. He'll be sorry he missed you." "He has my number," I said. "He does." Her gaze moved to the bag, to the files inside it. Claire. And her voice shifted to that warmer register, the confidential tone she used when she wanted me to feel she was confiding in me. "I know yesterday was difficult. I know this is a lot to absorb, but I hope you can understand that Jacob and I have been thinking about this for a long time, and we want what's best for everyone." "Including me?" I said. "Of course, including you." She looked at me with the patient, faintly wounded expression I recognized from years of conversations that ended with me absorbing the implication that my concerns were slightly too emotional to be addressed directly. "Your family, Claire." "Then explain to me," I said, "why my signature appears on a property deed modification that I have no memory of signing." The composure did not crack, but it adjusted, that same microscopic recalibration I had seen in the kitchen the previous afternoon. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "I think you do. And I think your attorney, the one you've been working with for at least 2 years, I think he knows too. I've asked my attorney to be in touch with him." I paused specifically on that word, your attorney, and watched what it did to her face. It was small, what it did, but it was there. "Diane, I need you to understand something. I have retained legal counsel. I have filed for an emergency freeze on our joint account. I have spoken to your neighbor, Patricia Sloan." I paused on that name and watched. For the first time in 6 years of knowing her, something in her voice was not managed. It was something closer to alarm. "Whatever Patricia told you, she doesn't have all the facts." "No one ever does," I said. "That's what lawyers and investigators are for." I went through the door. She did not stop me. I walked out of the house with my bag and my files and down the street to Margot's car, and I got in and said, "She's scared." "Good," said Margot. I called Rachel on the way back and told her about the conversation, about Diane's reaction to Patricia Sloan's name, about the specific texture of the recalibration I had seen in her face. Rachel listened and said, "It's time to make some calls." Over the following 10 days, a great many calls were made. Rachel filed the emergency petition and obtained a temporary freeze on the joint account, securing the remaining $43,000 that had not yet been transferred. Dennis Farrell traced the transferred $47,000 to an account in Diane's name at a regional bank in upstate New York, opened 18 months earlier. The DA's office, brought in on the basis of the fraudulent notarization, began their own investigation and within 5 days had spoken to the retired notary whose seal had been used without her knowledge or consent. She was appalled. She was cooperative. The real estate attorney, whose name Patricia had provided, declined to speak with Rachel's office voluntarily. He was then contacted by the DA's investigator, and he began to speak with considerably more willingness. Jacob called me 4 more times in the first 3 days. I let each call go to voicemail. In the third message, the controlled quality of the first was gone, replaced by something more raw and unsteady. A man who had expected a situation to proceed in one direction and found it moving very decisively in another. He said he knew he had handled things badly. He said he was sorry about the stairs. The first time he had acknowledged the stairs in any communication. He said his mother had perhaps been hasty. He said he wanted to figure out a path forward. He did not explain what the path backward had been. I texted him on the 4th day. Your attorney should be in contact with mine. I am not available for informal conversation at this time. He did not respond immediately. When he did, 12 hours later, it was one sentence. I never wanted it to go this way. I read that sentence for a long time. There is a kind of tragedy in the pathetic, not theatrical tragedy, but the smaller, more ordinary kind. A man who wanted something and took the available shortcuts and told himself at every turn that the compromise was not so large. Jacob Harlow was not a monster. He was a man who loved his mother in a way that had never matured beyond adolescent dependency, who had married a woman he also loved, but been unable to protect from the former love when the two came into conflict, and who had eventually slid from complicity to active participation in something that, when stated plainly, was fraud. His mother had planned the path. He had walked it. This understanding did not make it forgivable. On the 8th day, the DA's office issued a warrant, not for Jacob, whose role was still under investigation, but for the real estate attorney. His cooperation with the fraudulent notarization had been established sufficiently. He was arrested on a Thursday morning, and the news reached Diane through whatever channels it reached her, and her attorney called Rachel's office that afternoon. They wanted to talk. Rachel called me. "How do you want to play this?" she asked. "I want the house," I said. "I want the joint account restored to its balance before any transfers. I want full financial disclosure for the past 3 years. And I want an agreed statement of facts establishing what happened so that if this ever becomes relevant in any future proceeding, there is a record." "That's a significant ask," Rachel said. "They may push back." "They committed document fraud," I said. "The DA is involved. Tell them to look at their position and consider what they'd like to push back with." A pause. Something in Rachel's voice that was, very quietly, satisfaction. "I'll convey your terms," she said. The negotiation took 4 days, not because my terms were unreasonable. They were, if anything, restrained, but because Diane's attorney needed to manage his client's expectations, and managing Diane Harlow's expectations was not a swift process. She had planned for a very different outcome. She had planned to be in my kitchen. She had planned to be on my deed. She had planned, this emerged in the disclosed documents, which were more candid than anyone had perhaps intended, to eventually petition for a larger share of the property's value, using her fraudulently established ownership position as leverage in a divorce proceeding that she and Jacob had apparently anticipated I would eventually initiate. The plan, in full, was impressive in its scope and disturbing in its intimacy. They had known me well enough to predict how I would respond, with patience, with accommodation, with a gradual erosion of my own position that characterizes women who have been trained to prioritize relationship harmony over individual advocacy. They had built the plan around those predictions, and they had been correct in every particular. until the bank notification had appeared on Diane's phone at 4:44, and I had been standing close enough to see it. 4:44. The specific, arbitrary precision of it. If I had been in another room, if Diane had been holding her phone, if the notification had come 2 minutes later. What undid their plan was not any particular cleverness on my part. It was the ordinary, unremarkable passage of time to a specific moment and the geography of where two people happened to be standing. On a Thursday, 16 days after Diane had arrived in my kitchen with her spice rack and her settled certainty that the house was already effectively hers, her attorney signed the agreed settlement framework. The deed modification was voided and formally declared fraudulent in the county records. The $47,000 was returned to the joint account. Full financial disclosure revealed 2 additional smaller transfers, totaling $11,000, that had occurred in the preceding 3 months, also returned. Jacob's attorney communicated separately that Jacob accepted the terms of legal separation and would not contest my claim to the house in the divorce proceedings. He did not contest it. When I mentioned my surprise to Rachel, she said simply, "He knows what he did. He knows what the documentation shows. Contesting it would require him to testify, and testifying would require him to explain the stairs." She paused. "He's taking the exit that causes him the least additional damage." I thought about this, about the stairs, about the 11 steps and the way he had looked down at me from the top of them. I had reported the incident to the police on Rachel's advice 2 days after it happened, and there was now a report filed with photographs of my bruising and a statement in my own words. Nothing had been charged. The law in such matters is complicated in ways that frustrated me but that I understood. But there was a record, and the record, Rachel said, would matter. "He's never going to be fully accountable," I said. "No," she said. "But he's going to lose the thing he helped plan to take from you. And his mother is going to lose it too. And the man they paid to forge your signature is looking at criminal charges." She paused. "Full accountability is rare. Partial accountability is what we work with." I sat with that in the small conference room of Rachel's office, with the settlement framework in front of me and the afternoon sun coming through the window, and I tried to locate the feeling I had expected to have. I had expected anger or vindication or grief, the dramatic emotional resolution that follows dramatic events. But what I felt was quieter than any of those things. It was more like the feeling of having carried a very heavy bag for a very long time, and setting it down and standing upright and feeling the extraordinary, specific relief of your own unburdened posture. I signed the settlement framework. Rachel shook my hand. I called Margot. I drove to my house on a Friday afternoon in late October. The autumn light made everything look briefly illuminated from within. I parked in the driveway and sat in the car for a moment. The mums I had planted in September were still flowering, orange and bronze, along the front path. The trim on the windows was the correct color, ivory lace. I had been right about it. I let myself in through the front door. The house had been cleaned. Diane's things were gone. Her spice rack, her kitchen towels, the unfamiliar tins from my counter. The kitchen was my kitchen again, or rather an emptier version of it, but essentially itself. I went through every room, slowly, deliberately, the way you relearn a place. The living room, the study with its empty filing cabinet, the second-floor bedroom where the lamp on the landing still worked and its warm light still made the hallway feel like home. I stood on the second-floor landing. 11 steps below me was the spot where I had landed. The hardwood had a slight scuff on the 7th step from when we had moved the dresser up in the first year. I left it there. I went upstairs to the 3rd floor. Jacob's former office was empty, the desk gone, the bookshelves bare, just a room with good light. I thought about what I might do with it. Then I went back to the kitchen and opened the cabinets and looked at the spaces where things would go, and I made a list. In the months that followed, several things happened in their appropriate sequence. Diane was not charged with any crime directly. Her attorney had managed to position her as an advisory figure rather than a principal actor in the fraudulent transactions, a distinction that was partially accurate and partially the product of skilled legal maneuvering. She returned to her house in upstate New York. Patricia Sloan told me in a follow-up call in November that the neighborhood had received her return with a coolness that Patricia clearly found satisfying. The real estate attorney pleaded guilty to charges of filing a fraudulent notarized document and received, along with a fine and suspended sentence, the permanent revocation of his law license. It was not sufficient. I did not expect sufficient. I accepted partial. Jacob moved into an apartment. We communicated through our attorneys for the first several months, then occasionally by text for practical matters: divorce, paperwork, division of the remaining joint assets. The conversations were brief and civil and contained nothing that resembled the language of the 6 years we had spent as married people. He sent once a message that simply said, "I am sorry for what happened on the stairs." I read it many times. I did not respond. What do you say to that? Sorry is the language of aftermath, not of prevention. It is a word deployed when it is too late for the word to change anything material. I understood his sorry. I did not think it required a response. My grandmother's china, the pieces that survived, I repaired with a technique I had read about, filling the cracks with gold. It is a Japanese practice, and its philosophy is that breaks and repairs are part of the history of a thing and should be made visible rather than hidden. The repaired plates are not what they were. They are something that has been broken and put back together, and the evidence of that is now part of what they are, running in fine gold lines through the blue and white pattern. I keep them in the everyday cabinet and use them for ordinary meals, and sometimes, when I'm washing them, I run my finger along the gold lines and think about the word for this, which is kintsugi. The house is mine. Formally, legally, in the way that now comes with full financial disclosure and documented title, and a divorce settlement that Rachel described, professionally, as favorable. It is mine in all the ways it was always mine: the garden beds and the trim and the careful selection of rooms for purpose, and now also in the ways it was not. My name, only my name, on the deed. In the spring, I replanted the front beds, adding herbs alongside the mums, which I left because I have come to associate their bronze-orange color with the afternoon in October, when I drove home and saw them flowering along the front path, and that association is one I want to keep. Margot came for a weekend in May, and we sat on the back porch with wine and the sound of the garden, and she said, "You look different." Different how? Like someone who's put something down, she said. I thought about the heavy bag and the unburdened posture. I have, I said. Rachel Chen sent me a card in the spring. Attorneys do not generally send cards, and inside it she had written, "For what it's worth, this was one of the better outcomes. You were organized when it mattered. That made everything possible." I keep the card on my desk. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder that keeping your own records and reading your own documents and knowing your own finances is not paranoia. It is the basic practice of a woman who has learned not to assume that the structures of her life are held by someone else in good faith. I do not assume that anymore. Some evenings I sit in the kitchen at the table where I once sat in the early morning quiet with my coffee, and the quiet has a different quality now. Not the quiet of a life I do not yet know is ending, but the quiet of a life that is actually mine, that I have returned to after understanding what I had nearly let slip from my hands. It is a better quiet. It has more weight. It knows something. The lamp on the second-floor landing still makes the hallway warm at night. I have not replaced it. I thought about replacing it, whether it carries too much of the before, but every time I consider it, I decide against it. It is a good lamp. It gives good light. And I was right about the color on the trim, and I was right about the garden beds, and I was right in the end about myself. The gold lines run through the blue and white plates. The lamp lights the hallway. The house is mine. And I learned, this, finally, is what I learned, that the moment a woman stops letting things go is not a moment of crisis, but of beginning. It does not feel like beginning in the instant of it. It feels like falling. But falling, if you know how to read it, is not the end of the story. It is the place where you find out what you are actually made of, and what you will do next, and what is yours to reclaim. I know now. I knew the moment I hit the hallway floor and looked up at the 11 steps and felt, through the pain in my elbow and the grief of the broken china, the first clear breath of a woman who is done. Some things break, and the break is where the gold goes in.